Hi guys, Han here and welcome back superstars. If this is your first time here with me, hi, I'm Han. My pronouns are they, them. I'm a K-pop fan of almost 20 years and I've also worked here in South Korea as a marketing expert in the K-pop industry. Welcome to my universe. Recently on my channel, we have been covering the ongoing saga between HYBE, Min Hee Jin, ADOR and NewJeans, named affectionately on the channel as ADORgate. And today we'll be finishing up a recap of all of Min Hee Jin's legal cases with the big one, HYBE versus Min Hee Jin for the shareholder and stock option agreement. Now, mind you, this is a recap of everything up until the start of November. I know we're now in the middle of November and there have been updates. That video is coming very soon where we'll cover all the updates from all the cases in one go because I can only do so much with the time that I have. And also, if you're joining us for the first time, this is actually part 3 of a 3-part saga, but you'll be glad to know that you do not need to watch these in order. So you can watch this first in its entirety, take it all in, take a little coffee break, grab a snack, and then you can come back and you watch part 1 and part 2 at your own leisure. In the interest of integrity, I always like to give my disclaimers at the start of the video. Although I'm a fan of a lot of HYBE groups, I am actually indifferent to HYBE as a company because at the end of the day, which K-pop fan do you know who likes K-pop idol who also loves the company that they come from? Let's be real. That being said, I'm not a fan of Min Hee Jin. I think she's a horrible, narcissistic, selfish person who is out to destroy HYBE and NewJeans, and personally I think she can kick rocks. This video is not an opinion piece. This is simply me relaying the news to you in a fun and entertaining way. All my sources are linked below for your viewing and reviewing pleasure. And as always, I encourage you to take everything I say with a pinch of salt, add a dash of your own critical thinking, mix that in with the facts that you already know, and come to your own opinions. With that being said, you can check out all my coverage of ADORgate in the ADORgate playlist, which should be appearing above. And with that, let's get into today's video because we have a lot to cover, my friends. Okay, so before we get started, I want to lay out a few ground rules for you guys because I know there have been a lot of updates since I started recording this 3-part series. So I just want to make it clear that at the time of scripting this is after the ruling of the ADOR versus NewJeans case. So moving forward in the script, we are going to be referring to everything from that case as legal fact since NewJeans have chosen not to appeal. That being said, as I said in the video where I went over the results of the case, even though these are legal facts now, depending on additional evidence submitted by HYBE or Min Hee Jin herself, things can change. But we are going to do our analysis and make our predictions based on the information that we have available to us at the time that I'm recording this. I do also know that there have been updates to the B-Lif and Source Music cases since I made the videos on those cases, which was part 2 for those who haven't watched it yet. I will be doing some sort of follow-up at the end of this month, either as another video or as a live stream. So if you guys have thoughts and feelings about that, be sure to leave them down below and let me know what you want me to talk about. And finally, for the sake of time, I'm going to be going into as much detail as I need to without going into every single thing, just to give you guys enough understanding. At this point, if you've watched me for a minute, I'm sure you've watched my ADORgate summary. There's only 2 parts. You only need to watch part 1 to understand everything from this video. I'm going to try and avoid repeating all of that stuff because I tell you, we have a lot to go through regardless. With that being said, let's get into this case. Now, while the question at the heart of the ADOR versus NewJeans case was pretty straightforward, i.e. did ADOR violate the contract terms with NewJeans, justifying their unilateral termination notice? To which we now know the answer is no. But for this case, things are a little bit more complicated. There are 2 disputes taking place here. While both Min Hee Jin and HYBE agree that the shareholder agreement between them has been terminated, they are now battling it out in court to determine who violated the contract and thus who is responsible for the contract termination. Depending on that decision, it will determine what happens to Min Hee Jin's stock options. Either she will be able to cash out those stocks as per her shareholder agreement, which we'll be referring to as her exercising her put option, or HYBE will be able to buy back her stocks at a reduced rate, which will be referred to as exercising their call option. For both my financial and legal experts in the crowd, the point of this video is to make this information as easy to digest for the layman. So please do forgive me if I oversimplify some of the legal or financial jargon in order to make this easier to digest. Also, moving forward, just to make things clear, I will be interchanging the terms shareholder agreement, agreement and contract, as well as the terms stock options, stocks, or shares. So if you hear any of those things, just know that they are referring to the same thing. So now that we have our 2 legal questions, i.e. who is responsible for violating the contract and therefore who is responsible for the termination, let's look at each side's stance. In Min Hee Jin's corner, she's arguing that the April 2024 ADOR audit carried out by HYBE and her subsequent removal from the CEO position in August 2024 was unilateral, unjustified and illegal. In this case, she hopes to prove that she was wrongly dismissed and that HYBE broke the shareholder agreement unfairly, meaning that she would still be entitled to exercise her put option, which would have her stock value calculated with a 13x multiplier, netting her a cheeky 26 billion won. On the flip side, HYBE is stating that not only did they have solid legal ground to dismiss her from the CEO position and nullify her shareholder agreement due to her breach of duties and attempted corporate takeover of ADOR proven by the audit, but also that regardless of that, they had already exercised their call option clause back in July 2024, i.e. prior to the removal of Min Hee Jin from the CEO position, which took place in August, and that the contract explicitly allows them to do so even if the shareholder agreement has not been violated. The call option would also allow HYBE to buy back the stocks without the 13x multiplier, and this is not 100% confirmed, but I have seen a few reports saying that this would net Min Hee Jin about 3 billion won, which is barely enough to pay back the money that Bang Seok lent her to buy those stocks in the first place, which was 3.7 billion won originally, plus the government mandated interest rate on personal loans over a certain amount. In short, while both sides agree that the shareholder agreement has been terminated, who is responsible for that termination will ultimately decide how much money Min Hee Jin gets. If HYBE wins, Min Hee Jin is just going to get 3 billion, and if Min Hee Jin wins, she's going to get 26 billion. Also, I just want to clarify that there are actually two cases running simultaneously here. Shortly after HYBE gave Min Hee Jin notice in early July of their intention to exercise their call option, which actually took place on July 8th, which is my birthday. Sorry, that brings me to light. Min Hee Jin decided to sue HYBE executives for defamation, and HYBE responded by countersuing with a confirmation of shareholder agreement termination against Min Hee Jin at the end of July 2024. And then later, when Min Hee Jin left ADOR in November 2024, she also filed a put option suit against HYBE for her unpaid put options. The courts are tackling these two cases together through joint proceedings because the legal premise is the same and they're being handled by the same court. So moving forward, we're going to refer to them as one case. Before we get into the breakdown of the actual arguments being made by each side, I want you guys to also keep in mind that there is a pretty important catch in this case. While both sides are using the audit as part of their argument, HYBE is not basing their argument solely on that, and they've got two other aces up their sleeves. The first ace that HYBE has is the morality clause in Min Hee Jin's contract. Even on the off chance that the court does rule that the audit did not prove Min Hee Jin's breach of contract, and therefore was not reason enough for HYBE to terminate the shareholder agreement, if the rulings for the B-Lift Lab and or Source Music cases are made in their favour against Min Hee Jin, this would also be enough for HYBE to say that she did in fact violate the shareholder agreement based on her statements in the April 2024 press conference, because those are the basis of which they are suing her. There is a clause in Min Hee Jin's contract that says that if she causes over 500 million won worth of legal damages, she would be in violation of her shareholder agreement. So even though that is not the basis of what HYBE themselves are actually suing her for, those two cases would give HYBE an alternative argument if their current one doesn't hold up. Furthermore, HYBE hasn't actually sued Min Hee Jin over the fact that they exercised their call option. They're just saying that this has happened and saying that they had informed her of this at the time. And this is important because by Min Hee Jin's logic, HYBE violated the shareholder agreement in August when they removed her from the CEO position. But HYBE are claiming that they exercised their call option in July, which is prior to that. So even if it's shown that Min Hee Jin did not violate her shareholder agreement for any reason, HYBE still had the right to exercise their call option when they did, because it is irrelevant of the status of the shareholder agreement. So they could still argue that, okay, well, even if the court said the audit was fair, it doesn't prove breach of contract, and she hasn't broken her shareholder agreement, we still exercised our call option, so we still don't have to pay her. They have now given Min Hee Jin a lot of things she has to prove. Namely, there are three. Firstly, she has to prove that the audit did not prove that she violated her shareholder agreement. She has to prove that the statements she made in her press conference were not defamatory, therefore she has not violated the morality clause of her shareholder agreement, which is what she's doing in the B-Lift and Source Music cases. And thirdly, she needs to provide evidence that HYBE did not exercise their call option in July, which is really going to be a hard one. Only then will she be able to argue that she was wrongly dismissed in August, and thus that her November filing for her put options is actually valid. Now, I know this case has had a lot of precursor, but there's a lot of details that I want to make sure that are very clear before we get into the actual arguments. This is the final thing. We're going to go over the entire timeline, and then I'm going to break down the details of what happened at each moment, just so that you guys have a clear understanding of what happened. So, April 2024 is when the audit happened and Min Hee Jin gave her infamous press conference. And this is when HYBE and their labels are claiming that she broke her shareholder agreement. In July 2024, on July 8th, is when HYBE said they gave notice of Min Hee Jin of them filing and exercising their call options. And following this, on July 24th, is when HYBE issued notice to Min Hee Jin of their intention to terminate her shareholder agreement. On the very next day, Min Hee Jin filed her defamation suit, and a few days later, HYBE countersued with the confirmation of shareholder agreement termination lawsuit, which is what we're talking about now. In the following month of August 2024 is when Min Hee Jin was officially fired from the CEO position, and this is the point at which she says that HYBE broke the shareholder agreement. And then in November 2024 is when Min Hee Jin officially quit her position as creative director at ADOR, gave notice to HYBE of her exercising her put option, and filed legal action for her put option not being paid. January 2025 was when the first hearing of the shareholder agreement suit took place. April 17th, 2025 is when the second hearing of the shareholder agreement took place. June 12th was when the first hearing of the put option suit took place, aka this was a combined third hearing from the third case and this new case together. September 11th was the second hearing of the put option suit, which is aka the fourth hearing of everything. And then September 15th, there was news, very important news, that broke about Min Hee Jin allegedly tampering with evidence, which I'm sure you guys will love that part of the video. On November 27th is the upcoming third hearing, and on December 18th will be the final arguments given on both sides. So now, with the whole overview out of the way, let's get into the nitty-gritty. It's gonna be a long one, guys. Get your snacks. The first hearing for the shareholder agreement lawsuit took place in January 2025, but unfortunately, we don't actually have a lot of information about anything that happened at this hearing. We just know that it happened. And I think this is because this was overshadowed with the lawsuits from the other labels, NewJeans announcing their intention to rebrand, I think happened in this month as well, and also Min Hee Jin going to court with employee B. So if you remember, Min Hee Jin had 3 hearings in January: B-Lift, Source Music, and employee B. And I think January, it was either December or January, is when ADOR decided to file their injunction against NewJeans, and NewJeans said, let's go to court, we're ready, baby. Famous last words. Anyway, whatever the case, unfortunately this was a very busy month, and I think because this particular case is very business focused, I feel like a lot of people weren't that interested in it. What we do know about this hearing is that HYBE essentially gave their opening arguments as to why they thought the shareholder agreement had been terminated, since they were the ones suing Min Hee Jin and thus shouldered the burden of proof. It's unclear to what extent Min Hee Jin's lawyers would have responded, but if we use the ADOR versus NewJeans lawsuit as a benchmark, then we can assume that they likely would have just introduced their argument on a very surface level and stated their stance, with evidence to be presented later. Now, the second hearing of the shareholder agreement suit we do have a little bit more information about, and this took place on April 17th. However, this entire hearing ended up being very petty, because this is when we saw Min Hee Jin and her lawyers start to use their newfounded stalling tactic to delay the proceedings. I'm sure you guys are all very familiar with those by now. So, following the first hearing, Min Hee Jin and her lawyers submitted 2 written complaints, presumably saying that this was an unfair trial and that it was unjust, that it was a waste of their time. And following this, HYBE submitted additional supporting documents on April 11th, 14th, and 15th, just days before the April 17th trial. Now, of course, Min Hee Jin and her lawyers were not just going to let HYBE submit evidence against her. So they did actually post a statement on the 17th saying that they would be submitting rebuttals that would disqualify all of the evidence that HYBE submitted. Whether that actually happened or not, who knows at this point. They do a lot of talking and they always say they're going to do things that never come into fruition. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell. Anyway, for the hearing itself, bearing in mind that HYBE presented their arguments first in the first hearing, this time it was Min Hee Jin's side's turn to go first. And, well, in typical Min Hee Jin fashion, she wasn't happy with things being done the way they're supposed to be done. She and her lawyers insisted that HYBE needed to go first again, because while HYBE had given an introduction to their arguments in the first hearing, they needed to submit a full argument with evidence in this hearing before Min Hee Jin and her lawyers could prepare any rebuttal. Basically, they were saying that we haven't prepared anything extra beyond what we have already said in the introduction to our argument in the last hearing. So once we've got some more information from HYBE, then we'll give you our argument. They emphasized that because HYBE had the burden of proof, they had to give a full argument first, otherwise Min Hee Jin didn't know what was she supposed to be responding to, or her lawyers didn't. On HYBE's side, who had actually prepared to respond to whatever rebuttal Min Hee Jin would have presented this time around, disagreed. They stated that Min Hee Jin's side had not submitted any rebuttal even to the base claims they had made in the first hearing, so they didn't know what evidence they needed to prepare because they didn't know what claims they were arguing against. So in baby terms, at the first hearing, HYBE said, "You hit me and I have the medical records to prove it." Min Hee Jin's side basically responded with, "No, I didn't, and I can prove it with the CCTV." And in this hearing, Min Hee Jin is supposed to be presenting her CCTV footage, showing that she didn't hit HYBE. And then HYBE is supposed to discredit that CCTV by saying, "Look, that's AI. We can prove that this didn't happen. We can present the real CCTV," or something like that. But Min Hee Jin is essentially saying, "Prove that my CCTV is fake," without even showing the CCTV footage. That's basically the situation that's happening right now. Things obviously came to a deadlock, with Min Hee Jin's lawyers repeating that HYBE has the burden of proof to justify their claims first, and that they will respond only after they had more details. At which point the judge said, "Come on, you guys are not gonna act like children in my court." The judge actually ordered both sides to go back and submit written versions of their core arguments before the next hearing because they were tired of having their time wasted. And the next hearing, my oh my, this is where things get juicy. So the next hearing is the one that took place on June 12th, and this is where they combined the shareholder agreement and the put option lawsuits together for one joint proceeding. So now we're actually going to hear the majority of the arguments. In this third hearing, HYBE were first to speak again, and they started out by explaining why they thought Min Hee Jin was in fact guilty of having broken the shareholder agreement. They stated, "The purpose of the shareholder agreement was to foster ADOR's growth and to prevent actions harmful to HYBE. Evidence shows that Min Hee Jin planned to take NewJeans with her with the intent to break the contract." This contract being NewJeans' exclusive contract. Now, I like this explanation because I think it shows that HYBE have actually learned from the first injunction, the one that they lost against Min Hee Jin. This time, rather than focusing on the fact that she didn't fulfill her duties to HYBE, they're highlighting that she also did not fulfill her duties to ADOR, one of the key technicalities that she won her first injunction on. By trying to take NewJeans out of ADOR, she is actively hurting ADOR's growth. And arguably, even though she failed to do so, she has still done that because ADOR has not grown since this all began. From there, they moved on to justifying the audit itself, since this is important to explaining how they became aware of Min Hee Jin's violations. And they did this by presenting KakaoTalk messages, meeting logs, and files as evidence. Justifying the audit is essential for HYBE's argument because Min Hee Jin is arguing that the audit was targeted and retaliatory. So they have to prove that this wasn't the case. Fortunately, we know that HYBE already had the upper hand in that the courts in the NewJeans case and the police had already confirmed that the audit was completely legal, which strengthens their argument. Of course, this hadn't happened at the time of this hearing, but we know this in hindsight. Evidence-wise, they presented the Project 1945 file, as well as meeting logs from a meeting Min Hee Jin had had with the parents of NewJeans prior to having them file the fake complaint to ADOR. The goal of this complaint was to set in motion the events that would essentially lead to her terminating NewJeans' contract in accordance with her original plan, although we never got this far. And HYBE also presented the chat logs of her instructing her VP Lee Sang-woo, the guy who still evades all of this, I still need to know what this man is, to write the complaint in the voice of the parents. HYBE showed evidence that Min Hee Jin had not only given feedback on the complaint, but had also directly edited herself, having her fingers in the pie all the way down to deciding whose email would be used to send the complaint and receive it. This shows not only an intense level of planning and premeditation, but also that Min Hee Jin had actively been taking actions to carry out her plan. Again, tackling one of the key technicalities she won her first injunction on, because it said planning a takeover was not illegal, actually doing it is when it becomes legal. while she's doing things. Basically, at this point in time, HYBE was focusing on dismantling the foundations of Min Hee Jin's rebuttals before she could even make them. And once that had been set, they would be able to move into their justifications for terminating the shareholder agreement in later hearings. Personally, I think this is a good tactic because they're tackling the issue in chronological order in a way that is easy to understand and digest and doesn't allow Min Hee Jin to blur the waters by muddling up the timeline. That being said, Min Hee Jin's side were always going to give it a good old college try. Instead of focusing on proving why the audit was supposedly illegal, her side instead tried to focus on the timing of her exercising her put options and straight up lied about elements of the timeline. They started their argument with the statement: the put option was exercised in early November, whereas the NewJeans members' contract termination notices were delivered at the end of the month. The stealing accusation only emerged after those notices, and alleged actions tied to that claim began in December. They're basically saying that prior to Min Hee Jin trying to exercise her put options, HYBE's stance was Min Hee Jin tried to hurt ADOR. And it only became Min Hee Jin tried to steal NewJeans in December 2024 after Min Hee Jin had already left. Which is crazy considering Min Hee Jin was actively defending herself against accusations of meeting investors to take NewJeans to a new label in her April press conference. What are you talking about, girl? Not to mention, this is a label that we now know actually exists. And for those who didn't see it, I do have a second channel and I did a reaction to that news a couple of weeks ago now. So I'm not going to get into the details of that here. You can go and watch that video if you're interested. But one of the questions that many of you guys did ask and I wanted to address was in relation to the non-compete clause. So I just want to go over how that relates to this case. If HYBE wins and it's found that Min Hee Jin did violate her contract, then her 2-year non-compete is still valid. However, if Min Hee Jin wins and HYBE is found to be at fault, then it's a little bit more complicated because technically, according to the shareholder agreement, Min Hee Jin cannot start a competing business until she has sold her remaining 5% shares. Mind you, right now she's only trying to cash out 13%. But if the shareholder agreement is considered invalid, then the non-compete would likely also be considered invalid if HYBE were the ones to break it, meaning she could keep her 5% shares and also start her own business, I think, to the best of my understanding. Considering that the building for her label is still under construction, there is some speculation that she is intentionally dragging out proceedings so that by the time that she does actually lose, the 2 years of her non-compete would already be over anyway, and then she would just have the responsibility of selling her 5% stock before she could actually start to operate her business. And also she'd be able to use the media attention of her fans pitching her to kickstart her new business too. I do feel like HYBE would still potentially be able to sue her for setting up a company during the non-compete period, but that's a whole new set of lawsuits which would give her months to earn money from that company before she's actually hit with a fine or forced to close down. So Min Hee Jin may have accounted for that already. I'm not 100% sure, but that's what I could understand from the best of my research. Anyway, back to our main point. To sum up Min Hee Jin's lawyers' arguments, they claimed that HYBE's account of events had changed and was simply a fictional storytelling, calling the claims absurd and baseless. I did skip some of the finer details in terms of what evidence they presented because I've already talked about that in the 1-year recap, but moving forward, trust me, when we get to the next hearing, there's going to be a lot of details for you guys to look at, so look forward to it. One thing I do want to point out that I didn't mention in the actual arguments though is that Min Hee Jin's side did once again protest the presentation of the Kakao Talk messages in this case, as this is taking place in June, which is prior to the Yongsan police announcing in July that the Kakao Talks were legally obtained. However, HYBE did push back and say that the majority of the Kakao Talks they wanted to use at this stage had already been widely publicized in the media and were no longer anything new or anything private. With this third hearing having taken place in June and the fourth being set for September, there was quite a gap in between in which many things happened. But before we get into that gap, we're going to take a gap in this little video because I've been talking for an hour already and I'm tired. So this is your opportunity to go refill your drinks, run to the loo, have a little snack break, and also make sure to check if you've hit that like and subscribe button, because some of you have been watching me for a while, and while you may think you're subscribed, you might not actually be. Also, in case you haven't noticed, this is a long ass video. Which also means that it took me a long time to put it together, and I like to try and take my time to make sure that I give you guys the most accurate representation of the news that I can. But I do also know from you guys' reaction to the videos on my second channel that you do sometimes prefer a more snappy, in the moment reaction. So if you want to keep up to date with me in between videos, I highly recommend you check out my Instagram. The @ is, hi guys, Han here, because I've been sharing my reaction to news in real time on my stories. Not to mention, it's also a place where you guys can hang out with me in between uploads and get a peek into what life is really like in Korea. I know you guys are wondering where Oggy is for the intermission, but it's going to be a long video and I don't want to bother him right now because I'm scared he'll start meowing before I finish. But I will drop some clips of him in the video here and there as we go through the rest. So keep watching to see him. Anyway, this intermission is getting a bit long, so let's get back to it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's go. Now, as I said, there was a big gap between the June and September hearings, but a lot of important things took place during that time. First, of course, was the Yongsan police finding in July, where they stated that not only were the cacao talks legally obtained, but also that the audit carried out by HYBE on ADOR was completely legal too. However, at the same time, they did deny HYBE's request to press criminal charges against Min Hee Jin for breach of duty, which in essence gave both sides a bit of ammunition. Not only that, but ahead of the September 11th hearing on September 3rd, it was announced that both sides would be bringing in high-profile witnesses to testify at the next hearing. On HYBE's side, originally they were going to bring in their CFO, Lee Yong-jun, but this was later changed to CLO Chung Jin-soo, whereas Min Hee Jin's side decided to bring Min Hee Jin. Min Hee Jin coming as a witness to her own trial was obviously big news because this was essentially Min Hee Jin's first public statement in about a year. A lot of people pointed out that it's usually a bad idea to put a defendant on the stand in their own case because this puts them under further scrutiny and gives them ample opportunity to put their foot in their mouth. So many people saw this as Sejong being so desperate that they thought if Min Hee Jin did not testify, they were going to lose this case. Also, because Min Hee Jin's Kakao Talk messages had now been approved for use in court, her being able to explain the nuance herself could potentially control the narrative rather than leaving them up to HYBE's interpretation, provided she can actually offer decent and reasonable and logical explanations. Meanwhile, HYBE's witness is important because honestly, he's kind of a G. He's an ex-Kim and Chang lawyer, the same law firm working with HYBE on this case right now, which means he's going to be able to coordinate with the lawyers very well. And he also has over 25 years of experience in corporate law, especially in M&As, HR, PR, compliance, risk management, governance, and more. And he even has a few years experience as a CFO and CEO in some of his previous companies. So he understands how different parts of a company are affected as a business changes, as well as both the domestic and international business industry. This basically means that he can talk about the legal, financial, and operational effects that Min Hee Jin's actions would have had on HYBE, ADOR, and NewJeans in more detail than probably anybody else in that courtroom. And having that kind of person arguing your case is going to be a huge help to HYBE. So with their witnesses set, it's time to get into the thick of what they said. And that brings us to the 4th hearing that took place on September 11th. And my oh my, this is a doozy. In the interest of not adding another hour to this video, I am going to give you the bulk of the arguments, but I'm not going to go too deep into any particular argument. I know you guys love long videos, but I have to be able to edit this, so please forgive me, because this hearing was actually 4.5 hours long. And that means my reviewing of this hearing could also be 4.5 hours long. I don't think any of us want to be here that long because there's other things to talk about. Anyway, with that being said, we're going to take a closer look at what each witness said, the evidence that were presented, and the rebuttals presented alongside those. So, starting with HYBE's side, CL Chung Jin-soo was their star witness, and the questioning began with HYBE's lawyers asking the CLO about Min Hee Jin's shareholder agreement itself. And this is quite interesting because we do know a few things about the agreement, but we've not got all the details. So this is actually going to be HYBE's side explaining how they put together the agreement that they did. Now, one of the things that CLO Jong said that I personally found interesting is that HYBE was somewhat aware of the risk they ran having Min Hee Jin in a position of power and had taken preliminary steps to prevent her causing trouble. And I know this is a question that a lot of people ask. Why did Bang hire her? Why did they give her a company? Why did they give her so many special things? And this is basically HYBE saying, We knew she was a risk and we thought we had taken a calculated risk. They kind of didn't calculate very well. Maybe maths is not their strong point. But alas, to some extent, they knew who they were dealing with. When ADOR was established, HYBE invested a significant amount of money in the success of ADOR and gave Min Hee Jin a very generous deal with her put options. He mentioned that the 13x multiplier was something usually given to CEOs when they sold their companies or when the companies were acquired. But HYBE was directly involved in the establishment of ADOR, so this was an unusual case. The 13x multiple compensation was considered unusual and excessive. Normally, a multiple of this magnitude is awarded when a founder sells the company to HYBE or sells additional shares. In this case, HYBE established the company and hired a CEO, so that level of compensation was considered high. However, while HYBE was generous, they did also take a lot of precautions by adding special clauses to protect the company and prohibit actions that would hurt other labels. CLO Jung said that the reason for this was because of concerns HYBE already had regarding existing issues Min Hee Jin had had with other parts of HYBE even before ADOR was established. So remember, she was hired as a branding officer meant to deal with the branding for all HYBE artists before she was appointed as the CLO of ADOR. And clearly, she was already causing problems. A representative of an affiliated label would understand the purpose of the multi-label system even without such provisions and would make decisions that would allow for mutual growth. However, there were concerns that Min Hee Jin might not be one of those, so those clauses were explicitly included. I've also talked previously in a video about how Min Hee Jin really hates the multi-label system because it was one of the things that kept her in check and didn't allow her to damage HYBE as much as she wanted. So it's very clear that even HYBE knew from the beginning that Min Hee Jin was not a fan of the multi-label system too. Anyway, from there, CLO Jung went on to bring attention once again to the fact that Min Hee Jin hadn't just planned her takeover, she had started taking action. And he pointed to her contract renegotiations in December 2023 as the first signs of that. If you remember, Min Hee Jin had asked for the 13x multiplier to be changed to a 30x multiplier, for the non-compete clause to be removed from her contract, and to extend the CEO's powers to control idle contracts and the ability to control third-party contracts. All these things we now know would be essential for her to carry out the Project 1945 the way she had planned it. I thought that if the contract was revised like this, the CEO would have absolute authority, becoming an untouchable CEO. I was also suspicious of why they suddenly included such a clause in the negotiation plan, and I remember being concerned about that because of the similar tampering incident that had occurred before that and caused a huge social controversy. This is him referring to 50-50. Also, I do want to point out once again why the non-compete clause was essential. Even if Min Hee Jin left ADOR and got her put options under the original agreement, she would still be tied to her non-compete and her remaining 5% shares in ADOR. The non-compete dictates that she has to hold those shares for at least 2 years after leaving ADOR, and then only once she successfully sold those 5% shares after the 2 years is up would the non-compete expire. So she was worried about being tied to ADOR indefinitely if she was unable to sell her shares. Although CLO Jung couldn't directly make accusations because he's being called as a witness, not as a lawyer, his testimony clearly was designed to add weight to the argument that HYBE made in the previous hearing that Min Hee Jin's plan had already begun to take shape long before the audit, and that HYBE had already somewhat been aware and alarmed by her transparent actions. From there, he gives further weight to the suspicions by explaining how HYBE received the tips from various investors about Min Hee Jin running around and trying to get investment into her future venture, i.e. her new label, both before and after the audit. Starting as early as late 2023, prior to her contract negotiations, and running until the start of 2025, just prior to the March ruling against NewJeans in their injunction trial. I received suspicious tips from both internal and external sources in early 2024. As far as I remember, around February of 2024, an outside director at the time tipped off CEO Park Ji-won, saying, "Do you know that the people at ADOR are planning to become independent and are asking private equity funds for help? Check it out." Around March, one of our major shareholders at HYBE contacted me from Dunamu saying, "Min Hee Jin suddenly requested an exclusive meeting. I don't know why she's asking to meet. It's suspicious." You might remember that during Min Hee Jin's original press conference, she said that the claims that she was meeting with investors was ridiculous. And if that were the case, HYBE should bring those investors forward. We had already known that some of these investors were Neva and Dunamu, who were the ones who tipped off HYBE in February, as well as Davalink was one of the investors she met post-audit. But it was still interesting to see HYBE's witness actually name these people on the stand. He is naming these people openly, giving even more credit to this accusation, because if he's lying, that's perjury, and we'll get to that. Not only that, while Min Hee Jin had originally said in her press conference that she never met any investors, she did in fact later change her story to say that, well, she had met some investors, she had simply met them for personal reasons at social and networking events, not for business. Again, even though the investors themselves have come out to say otherwise. Now, alongside his explanations of why HYBE had become suspicious enough to feel the need to carry out an audit, he did also add further context to the involvement of NewJeans' parents and how Min Hee Jin had tried to use them. He mentioned their various meetings and how Min Hee Jin would twist HYBE's words in a way that would control the opinions of the parents, and then she could manipulate them to act in the way that she wanted, such as having them submit a complaint about suspected plagiarism by Eyelet, a complaint we all know she had written by VP Lee and then edited herself. Everyone was worried and surprised when they received that email. This is because the plagiarism issue being raised is very subjective, so I think there should be ample opportunity to meet and talk about whether it is plagiarism or not and to resolve any misunderstandings. But when they suddenly sent an official email and included the artist's parents in the email, I got the feeling that they were trying to cause serious problems rather than solve them. Jung mentioned that in the complaint email, they already mentioned that this could be a violation of the exclusive contract, which stood out to him as a red flag that they weren't looking for a solution, but rather trying to find an excuse to start a dispute. This was the final straw that pushed HYBE to start their investigation, launching the audit, and discovering the Project 1945 document that finally helped all the puzzle pieces fit into place. Within that Project 1945 document, alongside other documents written by VP Lee, such as HYBE's 7 Deadly Sins, a document made up of points they could use to attack HYBE publicly, they said that they finally realised the true extent of Min Hee Jin's plans thanks to those documents and Min Hee Jin's cacao talks with her shaman. Contents from these documents were included in the written complaint email from the parents, and all the suspicions were confirmed by her right-hand man himself when they carried out the audit and questioned him. Vice President Lee met with us and explained in detail what he had done for Min Hee Jin and confessed his suffering. We asked what the documents meant, why they were made this way, and who had ordered them to be made. And Vice President Lee answered them one by one. According to the Vice President's explanation, Min Hee Jin instructed him to compile a list of ways to harass HYBE's executives, so he said he created it. Also, in regards to the writing of the complaint letter in the voice of the parents, Jung also added that Min Hee Jin and VP Lee explained that they could attack HYBE with that content, but since they had a shareholder agreement, it would be awkward to attack under their own names. So they decided to send emails under the parents' names. To be clear, all the statements and confessions from VP Lee were made as a result of the audit. So he completely came clean about everything that Min Hee Jin had done and he had been instructed to do for her up until that point, and also the fact that she had promised him shares in her new company if he helped her successfully remove NewJeans from ADOR. Although he did realign himself with Min Hee Jin again later on, especially when the case with employee B came to light, he did give HYBE a lot of damning evidence. And again, I really wonder where this man is now, because I think it would be so interesting to hear what he has to say if he is ever summoned to the stand. All in all, CLO Jung's testimony basically served as a roadmap of how HYBE had gone from noticing a number of concerning coincidences to having noticed enough of a pattern to justify a full-blown audit, and how that audit was what then led them to truly realising the extent of Min Hee Jin's plans and coming to the conclusion that continuing with Min Hee Jin was simply unrealistic. There are a few more specifics he did touch on, and I do highly recommend you guys check out the source and read the detailed account of all the things he said. Unfortunately, it's far too much to cover in this video, and it repeats a lot of what we already know regarding the cacao talk messages, but it is definitely interesting stuff. His testimony not only solidified why HYBE had to do the audit and why Min Hee Jin's termination was justified, but it also highlights how that even now, after everything, Min Hee Jin still hasn't given up on her plan of trying to extract NewJeans from ADOR and hurt HYBE in the process. Now, While HYBE's witness statement focused on laying the groundwork for their argument with facts and anecdotes, Min Hee Jin's appearance was far more theatrical, as her return to the public eye was highly anticipated, for better or for worse. From her arrival, she made sure she was camera ready and controlled the media narrative once again. She walked from the car to the courtroom with a big smile on her face so that she could appear confident, and a lot of people took note of her weight gain, which could be seen as a sign of her eating and sleeping well from how idle she is with all her free time, or her stress eating from the anxiety. Now, I do just want to say, I personally will not be making any fat jokes or body shaming jokes about Min Hee Jin, because I personally am a strong believer of the fact that while you may feel you're criticizing a random lady on the internet who will never see your comments, your friends and family and the people around you will see the kind of comments you make, and they will see that you think it's okay to talk that way about people's weight just because you don't like them. And I personally don't stand for that. Fat shaming is wrong regardless of who the person is on the receiving end, and I will not be doing that. So keep it out of my comments. Thank you very much. Anyway, let's jump into that testimony she actually gave. Is what I'd be saying if she actually gave one. As I mentioned, this hearing was 4.5 hours long, but it was actually cut short because in Korean court, witnesses are not only allowed to give their testimonies, but they're also allowed to cross-examine each other. And instead of giving any real testimony, Min Hee Jin spent all the time she could disputing random insignificant parts of CLO Jung's testimony, ignoring the heart of the issue as much as possible, which meant that the hearing ultimately ended with only CLO Jung actually being questioned. We all know that Min Hee Jin is a chief yapper, so she made sure to keep talking until the court session was finally dismissed. But here's what she had to say about CLO Jung's testimony. She started with a very dramatic opening statement. I came out to have a fair discussion, but I don't know why. There were so many lies that I thought I would have been in big trouble if I hadn't come out today. From there, she jumped straight into accusing CLO Jung of perjury, saying that he lied about numerous things, the first of which being HYBE's stance about her contract renegotiations and the fairness of the non-compete clause. During his testimony, CLO Jung had mentioned that he thought it was unreasonable for Min Hee Jin to call her contract a slave contract during her press conference because the non-compete clause was a normal and reasonable thing to include. It was a very unconventional contract that promised a lot of compensation, so I don't agree with Min Hee Jin saying it was unfair. I remember many ordinary people reacting to the news at the time saying, if this is a slave contract, I'd gladly be a slave. Furthermore, Jung had stated that HYBE had expressed that they were willing to negotiate further even if they couldn't give her the exact revision she had requested in December 2023. However, Min Hee Jin claimed that HYBE's readiness to continue negotiations was never communicated to her. To which Jung pointed out that he had literally emailed her lawyers stating that HYBE was open to negotiations. But she insisted she had never seen any such email, and her lawyers remained silent during this exchange. Now, call me crazy, but this sounds like it's a problem between Min Hee Jin and her lawyers' communication, and it's not a good sign that your lawyers are being very quiet while letting you talk yourself into a very disprovable hole. Min Hee Jin then moved on to claims regarding manipulation of album sales numbers. In previous statements, she had alluded to chart manipulation taking place to increase Islet's first week last day sales to a point that would beat NewJeans' record. She did also mention Le Sserafim getting the same treatment, but focused on Islet's debut as they are direct competitors of NewJeans. Now, to make this clear, in Korea, the total number of sales in the first week of comeback is basically media bragging rights to show off how popular your artist is. If you're a PC collector, you will know very well that it's usually towards the end of the first week that lucky draws are announced, and the purpose of this is to boost sales at the end of the first week to get as many sales as possible within that first week window. So generally you will see that the last day or two of the first week will have an increase in album sales, and this is what Min Hee Jin is addressing, saying that this is album stuffing, i.e. illegal buying or manipulation of album sales to set higher records. In her original April press conference, Min Hee Jin had thrown out these accusations for the first time, and during his testimony, CLO Jung had stated that no such thing had ever happened, and he was shocked to hear these allegations about Islet's album sales being inflated. During her cross-examination, Min Hee Jin insisted that they had inflated the numbers, noting that Islet's debut album sold 80,000 additional copies on the final days of its initial release week, and claimed this was a targeted attempt to outshine NewJeans' record. However, HYBE's lawyers were quick to counter this claim and pointed out the fact that even NewJeans had seen a sales increase of 300,000 copies on the last day of their first week for their Get Up album release. So couldn't you use the same logic to say that NewJeans cheated too? Of course, they did clarify that they believed that there was no sort of album stuffing taking place for either artist, but this was just a standard practice phenomenon caused by fan signs, lucky draws, those kind of events that take place in the last week. And this had already been confirmed by an independent auditing agency. Min Hee Jin still pushed forward with her claims, saying that she had messages with other HYBE insiders, including the CEO of COS Entertainment, home of Boy Next Door, and a Japanese interpreter at HYBE Japan, amongst others, who had given confirmation about album stuffing, not only of NewJeans, but of another popular HYBE girl group. Any bets on who that is? HYBE also pushed back on this claim, however, saying that Min Hee Jin used her high position over some of the supposed insiders to coerce favourable responses. They stated that when the company actually spoke with these people, they confessed they were merely agreeing with Min Hee Jin's words. Basically saying they were just humouring her, you know, the same way you'd listen to your best friend and complain about her boss getting angry at her for missing a deadline, when you'd both know full well she was out partying the night before. The final point of contention that Min Hee Jin came back to was the accusation of her meeting with investors, and this was honestly one of my favourite things because it shows her true nature once again. She completely throws VP Lee under the bus, saying that the meeting with Naver was set up by him, not by her directly. Mind you, Naver being one of the first investors who reached out to HYBE to warn them about Min Hee Jin's activities. She also boldly denied ever seeking out any other investors too. I've never tried to meet with other investors before. If it's true, submit evidence or call them as witnesses. Among them, the CEO of Company D contacted me first, saying he wanted to receive tickets to the NewJeans Tokyo Dome concert. HYBE were completely unfazed by this, however, saying that they had evidence of Min Hee Jin contacting the Saudi Arabian government and would submit evidence detailing the specifics of their meeting and the things discussed. To which Min Hee Jin scoffed and burst out laughing, saying she was surprised HYBE could submit evidence of something that never happened. Wow, girl, you're in the court of law. Have some respect. Anyway, I do want to touch on why Saudi Arabia is interesting, and this might be a bit boring for you guys, but personally, I am interested in geopolitics and economics. And you might know that the Middle Eastern countries are obviously very rich from oil, but as the world moves towards more sustainable energy sources, they are trying to diversify their income streams. And one of the main things that the Middle Eastern countries have decided to do is hyper invest in entertainment. So they are creating like the esports arenas, they are creating theme parks, and they are trying to bring in more foreign artists to perform. That's why we saw an event like the World Cup taking place in Qatar and Jungkook's performance. They want to bring in entertainment money. So if Min Hee Jin was looking for investors to invest into her new company, and she's also looking for people who would be somewhat ignorant to her past with SM and now HYBE, Saudi Arabia would actually be a very good choice, and Lord knows they've got a lot of money to spend. Anyway, the heart of the issue with Min Hee Jin's claims regarding investors is that she's inconsistent. As we said, sometimes she insists that she never met investors, like at her first press conference. Then she says that she met them, but it was only for networking purposes. Then she said that, okay, she met them, but it wasn't her who organized the meeting. And then she said, no, they're the ones who actually contacted me first. But we literally have investors saying she approached me and she made this proposal. And I thought it was fishy. Like, she can't even get her own story straight. And then we literally have these mystery investors giving their side of events, and she has yet to actually directly explain away any of those accusations. And yet she's still saying, if there are investors, bring them as witnesses. What is she gonna do if they show up in November with HYBE's lawyers? I would love to see. As you can see, Min Hee Jin can't seem to get her own story straight. And I think it's worth mentioning that while she is technically cross-examining CLO Jung right now, I believe she is still under oath herself. So if HYBE are able to present evidence of things like her meeting the Saudi Arabian government for investment, she likely would have just perjured herself. But I could be wrong at that point, so I guess we'll have to wait and see until she gives her actual testimony in the next hearing, because as I said, she wasn't actually able to give a testimony in this hearing because they ran out of time. And I'm very interested to see how she's going to explain away all the things that she has to, and the kind of questions they're going to ask her with some of the latest news that's been going on too. Anyway, to summarize everything at this hearing, HYBE side focused their argument on showcasing how Min Hee Jin had planned and already began taking action for her management takeover. This included involving the parents of NewJeans and her VP, who worked according to her directions, falsifying documents, emails and more to paint the picture she knew would be advantageous to a vendetta against HYBE, and how she'd already been seeking out investors for her post-HYBE venture with NewJeans in tow, long before the audit ever happened, and how all these suspicious behaviours plus investor tip-offs had been what triggered the audit investigation. This provides a direct and clear counter-argument to Min Hee Jin's claim that HYBE was targeting her due to her internal complaint about Eyelet. On Min Hee Jin's side, she claimed that HYBE were twisting the truth about her contract negotiations to make her seem nefarious for asking for what she believed she was entitled to, accused the company of dishonest album stuffing tactics with Eyelet's debut album to outshine NewJeans' achievements as a way to push them out of the limelight and replace them, and finally claiming that HYBE were intentionally misinterpreting her meeting with investors as intentional business moves to strengthen their management takeover narrative. She actually avoided responding to any of the evidence HYBE had provided, and instead focused on trying and failing to craft a new narrative that continues to paint herself as a victim. One other thing that I do want to mention is that once again, Min Hee Jin repeatedly objected to HYBE showing her Kakao Talk messages in the open court, saying they were an invasion of her privacy even if they were legally obtained. And while HYBE actually conceded, saying that they would skip the Kakao Talk messages being actively explained in court, they did request that the judge thoroughly reviewed the conversations between Min Hee Jin and VP Lee, as they would illustrate why Min Hee Jin was so against her messages being shown publicly. And these Kakao talks will continue to be an integral part of this battle on both sides, because just a few days later, news broke that cast serious suspicion about Min Hee Jin and just how far she was willing to go in order to win this case and secure her money. And that was on September 15th. A news article was posted claiming that Min Hee Jin had scripted some of the Kakao Talk message she had submitted as evidence. And this is extremely ironic, since Min Hee Jin is the one who is always first to say that you're only showing part of the conversation and you're taking it out of context and you've doctored these messages. Talk less the fact that submitting falsified evidence is highly illegal. Now, the way she was caught is that on the day prior, on September 14th, HYBE actually challenged the evidence she had submitted by submitting the original versions of those conversations. And seriously, how dumb do you have to be to feel confidence enough to submit doctored conversations knowing full well your opponent can not only see all the evidence you submit, but has access to your entire chat log? Like, how stupid! The messages she had tried to manipulate were actually a conversation between herself and VP Lee Sang-woo, in which he instructed him saying, "I'm going to screenshot this, so make sure to write it well." She was literally instructing him to think and calculate the responses he would send so that she could screenshot their conversation and submit it as evidence later should it be needed. Which means she was already planning to use her messages as evidence in court, the same way she used them in her first press conference. However, she obviously didn't expect HYBE to have access to these messages too, because mind you, this conversation we're referring to took place in January 2024, long before the audit. So she is already in January 2024 planning to go to court and planning to use these chats as evidence. But you know what the ironic part was? Even in the version that she herself submitted, the line, "I'm going to capture this, so write it well," was at the top of the screenshots that she shared. Like, girl, you are literally telling on yourself, get it together. This is the stuff your lawyers be doing for NewJeans, but you shouldn't be doing this to yourself. I'm rooting for her, but like, come on now. Anyway, alongside the fact that she had instructed VP Lee on how he should write his messages, she had also actually cut out some of the lines of the conversation they had in order to make it look like one consistent conversation. So just to summarize this in a way that makes things very clear, back in January, she and VP Lee were having a conversation, and she had been planning to use this conversation as evidence to show that she and VP Lee felt pressured by HYBE even before she submitted her complaint about Eyelet's alleged plagiarism, making it seem like they were victims sharing their grievances about the company oppressing them and, by extension, NewJeans. So at the start of the conversation, she instructs him, make sure you write this conversation well because I'm going to screenshot it. And as he would be replying, in between his replies, she'd be like, nope, delete this, cut this out, rewrite this, do it again, as if she's directing him how to respond. And I want to say that at the time they were having this conversation, this was January 2024, you could not edit a Kakao Talk message after you sent it. You'd have to delete it. And then you could delete it from your chat log, but then the messages may still show on the recipient side, and all the messages would still be on the server, which HYBE had access to. So basically, if you were to open Min Hee Jin's phone now, we would only see the final version of the conversation that she was happy with, because she would have deleted all the messages from Isang-woo that didn't meet her standard, and she would have deleted all the messages of her instructing him to change what he'd written. But the version that HYBE had access to had the full transcript. And this is now the comparison that is being made between the two versions that were submitted to court. This shows that Min Hee Jin had intentionally doctored the conversation in a way that she knew would look beneficial to herself. But it's, in my opinion, extremely dumb to now submit that, knowing full well that HYBE has the full transcript. Maybe she thought the server version would also be the same as what she can see on her phone, but I think that was a dumb gamble to take, and clearly it did not work out for her. Again, let me also point out that I read the fact that she is always the one who is first to accuse other people of taking her messages out of context. In response to these accusations, Min Hee Jin actually wrote a response to the newspaper Sportsdogan, who had been the one to write the expose about the allegedly forged evidence. And she said that the previous trial only gave ADOR's witness a chance to speak, so the reporting is biased because she wasn't actually able to present a full argument. Again, her twisting the truth because she was the reason that they never got to her testimony. Also, I do want to point out that she said ADOR's witness in the statement, even though this is a case against HYBE. But I guess Girlie's a bit confused. She's literally been in court every week this month. So at this point, I'm not surprised that she doesn't know who she's arguing with, because I would be tired. I don't know how she's got the mental capacity to keep up with all of this. And maybe she doesn't, which is why she's making mistakes like this. But it's also funny to think that ADOR is living rent-free in her mind 24/7. Anyway, in her statement, she continued that she will have her chance to speak during the next hearing on November 27th. So the reporting right now is not accurate and fair, and that newspapers should refrain from spreading falsehoods. Which, in case you didn't notice, within that whole statement, there is no denial. She never once denied that she edited the messages. She simply said, y'all don't have the full story yet. Don't jump to conclusions until I've had my chance to speak. Just another one of her manipulative ways of speaking that I wanted to point out. Anyway, I thought this was pretty important news because it incites investigation and scrutiny into all evidence that Min Hee Jin may have submitted across all her trials. Because if she's willing to edit her messages, what else is she willing to forge, right? Not to mention, this accusation also gives further credibility to HYBE, Belief, and Source Music's arguments as well, because if she's going as far as to edit her own Kakao Talk messages, she's indirectly admitting that they're damning in their original form, which means that she's done something wrong that they can now use against her. And as I mentioned already, Min Hee Jin has previously accused HYBE of doctoring her messages on numerous occasions, but this is not even the first time that we have caught her lying. In the case of Employee B, she also shared Kakao Talk messages on her Instagram. Remember the ones in which she docked Employee B and shared her personal information? And it was the fact that those messages were dishonest in their representation that Employee B actually went on to have her JTBC interview and file legal action against Min Hee Jin. Until that point, she had not had any intention and had not taken any legal action. Now we've seen that she's done this in this case too. And we also know that NewJeans had submitted redacted, i.e. edited, versions of Kakao Talk messages during their injunction for the Ignoregate case, and it was Min Hee Jin's own submission of the actual Kakao Talk messages that ADOR were then able to use against NewJeans. But it shows that there is a pattern of Min Hee Jin and NewJeans' side of editing the narrative or editing messages or redacting messages in a way that shifts what those messages represent. So now we have to ask ourselves, those messages she showed us back in the very first press conference, are they still to be trusted? Yes, probably those messages exist, and Bang PD and now former CEO Park Ji-won did actually say those things, but I wonder in what context. And I wonder if we saw the full conversation, would that change our impression of those messages? And of course, as I already said, if Min Hee Jin is willing to lie about her Kakao Talk messages, what else is she willing to lie about? Well, we'll probably get more insight into that in the next hearing, which is set to take place in just a few days on November 27th. And at this hearing, Min Hee Jin will be called to the stand to give her testimony and then be cross-examined. If my understanding is correct, her own lawyers will question her first, and then she will be cross-examined by HYBE's lawyers and their witness, CLO Jung. And with the recent news of NewJeans' split in loyalty, the potential return of some of the members, Min Hee Jin's attempt to sway public sentiment by insisting that NewJeans members must be 5, and the potential dispatch expose of damning evidence of Min Hee Jin given to HYBE by none other than the youngest members of NewJeans themselves, I think it's fair to say that this testimony is going to be monumental. And personally, I think the response to this testimony will be the decisive moment in this case. I imagine this will also be where HYBE attempts to catch Min Hee Jin in her lies and get her to accidentally admit to her takeover plans, thus giving them justification to terminate their shareholder agreement and to press the criminal charges dismissed by the police once again. Following the November 27th hearing, providing everything runs to schedule, which we can never guarantee with Miss Min Hee Jin, December 18th will be the final argument of this case, which means that we can expect to hear the first instance ruling probably as early as late January, but by my estimate, probably mid-February of 2026. It has been a wild ride up until this point, and we are about to hit the climax. So strap in and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next breakdown. Thank you all for getting through this long one with me today. I hope it was helpful, and I hope the energy wasn't too low because I am recording this after work on a Monday, so I'm a bit tired. And just before we finish this video, I feel like we probably would hit this milestone either by the time this video goes up or shortly after, but I really want to sincerely thank you guys for 9,000 subs! I genuinely can't believe how much this channel has grown over the last year. Despite the somewhat dramatic nature of what I'm covering, I am so grateful to have such an understanding and warm and like supportive community. So I really appreciate all of my superstars and my supernovas, channel members. And also I just want to thank all of you for spending your precious time here with me. There's so much other content you guys could be watching on Beyonce's internet. But yeah, I really do appreciate you guys. I have something special planned for the end of this year and some exciting stuff planned for next year. So look forward to it. This has been Han from the Haniverse. Thank you for, thanks for stopping by. Bye guys. It's 2 AM. I'm going to sleep. I'm tired.